Right now, somewhere in the world, 3 cups of coffee are being poured every single second. Over 2 billion cups today. Over the course of your life, if you drink coffee, you will consume enough of it to fill a small swimming pool. But here's what almost nobody realizes when they're standing in line half asleep, waiting for their order. This drink didn't just wake people up in the morning, it woke up the entire world. It funded revolutions, it built empires, it got people executed, it sparked the Enlightenment. It fueled the French Revolution. It was banned, outlawed, smuggled, and fought over for 400 years. And it all started with a goat. At least that's how the story is usually told. Somewhere in the highlands of Ethiopia, sometime around the 9th century, a goat herder named Kaldi noticed something strange. His goats, after eating the red berries from a certain shrub, wouldn't sleep at night. They pranced. They bleated. They practically danced through the hills, full of an energy no ordinary plant should have given. Kaldi tried the berries himself, and according to legend, he felt it too. A lightness, an alertness, a strange new kind of energy that hadn't existed in his world before. Now, historians can't confirm Kaldi actually existed. The story wasn't written down until centuries after it supposedly happened, and by then it had already been passed through generation after generation of oral tradition. But here's what historians do agree on. Coffee's story really did begin in Ethiopia, in a region called Kaffa, which may be exactly where the drink gets its name. Wild coffee plants grew there long before anyone thought to brew them into a drink. The Oromo people of Ethiopia are believed to have discovered something remarkable long before Kaldi's goats supposedly did. They didn't drink coffee at first, they ate it. They crushed the raw coffee cherries, mixed them with animal fat, and rolled the mixture into small energy balls. Warriors carried these into battle. The caffeine gave them stamina. The fat gave them calories. It was, in a sense, the world's first energy bar, a survival food that happened to also be a stimulant thousands of years before anyone in a lab coat ever isolated caffeine as a chemical compound. But eating coffee cherries is a long way from the rich aromatic drink you might be sipping right now. Somewhere between those early energy balls and the modern cup, something had to change. And that change happened not in Ethiopia, but just across the Red Sea, in the deserts of Yemen. By the 1400s, coffee had crossed into the Arabian Peninsula, likely carried by traders moving between the Horn of Africa and the port cities of the South Arabian coast. And it was here, in Sufi monasteries in Yemen, that coffee transformed from a chewed stimulant into something closer to what we drink today. Sufi mystics needed to stay awake. Their religious practice involved long nights of prayer, chanting, and meditation. And staying alert for hours in the dark wasn't easy. Someone, and history doesn't record exactly who, discovered that roasting the coffee beans and brewing them in hot water created a dark, bitter liquid that kept the mind sharp and the body awake for hours. They called it kwahwa. It's a word that originally meant wine, which is fascinating because coffee was about to do something wine had never managed to do. It was about to become one of the most socially explosive drinks in human history. By the early 1500s, coffee had spread from religious circles into the bustling port city of Mocha in Yemen. A name you've almost certainly heard on a coffee shop menu without knowing its origin. From Mocha, ships carried coffee beans across the Arabian Peninsula, and soon the drink reached Mecca, then Cairo, then Damascus, then Constantinople. And that's when everything changed. Because coffee didn't stay in monasteries. It moved into the streets, and in the streets, it created something the world had never quite seen before. The coffee house. The first coffee houses opened in the Ottoman Empire in the 1500s, and they were unlike any public space that had existed before them. Taverns served alcohol, which dulled the mind and loosened tempers. Coffee houses did the opposite. They sharpened the mind and loosened the tongue in a completely different way. People gathered, they talked, they debated politics, literature, religion, philosophy, and gossip, all while sipping a drink that kept them wide awake and alert for the conversation. In Constantinople, these coffee houses became known as schools of the wise, because scholars, poets, and merchants would sit for hours discussing ideas that never would have surfaced in a quiet library or a private home. And this made certain people extremely nervous, because a room full of alert, awake people freely exchanging ideas is exactly the kind of thing that terrifies anyone in power. In 1633, the Ottoman Sultan Murad IV did something almost unthinkable. He didn't just discourage coffee, he banned it outright and made drinking it punishable by death. Some accounts even claim he would patrol the streets of Constantinople in disguise. And if he caught someone drinking coffee, he would personally have them executed on the spot. It sounds almost too dramatic to be real, but it reveals something crucial about what coffee actually was. It wasn't just a beverage, it was a threat. A room full of coffee drinkers was a room full of people thinking clearly, talking freely, and organizing ideas. And that made rulers across multiple empires deeply uneasy. Coffee survived the ban, as banned things often do. Murad IV died in 1640, and coffee houses crept back into public life almost as quickly as they'd been shut down. But the pattern had been set. Wherever coffee went next, it would keep sparking the same fear in the powerful and the same fascination in everyone else. And soon, coffee was about to leave the Islamic world entirely and step onto a continent that had absolutely no idea what was about to hit it. Europe first encountered coffee through trade with the Ottoman Empire, and at first, Europeans didn't quite know what to make of it. Venetian merchants brought it back in the late 1500s and early 1600s, and it quickly earned a nickname that sounds almost comical today: the bitter invention of Satan. Some Catholic clergy in Europe genuinely worried that coffee was a tool of the devil, smuggled in from the Muslim world to corrupt Christian minds. They petitioned Pope Clement VIII to ban it entirely, but according to popular legend, the Pope decided to try it himself before making a ruling, and he loved it. The story goes that Clement VIII was so delighted by the drink that he declared it should be baptized, making it acceptable for Christians to drink, supposedly saying it would be a shame to let the devil have exclusive claim to something so delicious. Historians debate how much of this story is true, but what's certain is that coffee was never banned by the Catholic Church. And by the mid-1600s, it was spreading rapidly across European cities. England got its first coffee house in Oxford in 1650, and London followed shortly after in 1652. And just like in Constantinople, these coffee houses became something far more powerful than places to grab a drink. They became engines of ideas. London's coffee houses earned the nickname penny universities, because for the price of a single penny, you could buy a cup of coffee and sit for hours listening to some of the era's sharpest minds debate science, politics, business, and philosophy. Unlike taverns, where alcohol blurred judgment, coffee houses sharpened it. People came not to escape their thoughts, but to exercise them. Isaac Newton frequented coffee houses. So did many of the era's most important scientists, writers, and merchants. In fact, some historians argue that the flourishing of ideas during the scientific revolution and later the Enlightenment can't be fully separated from the rise of coffee culture. When you replace a population's daily drink of choice with something that sharpens the mind instead of dulling it, you shouldn't be surprised when that population starts producing more ideas. But coffee houses weren't just intellectual salons, they were also becoming the birthplace of entire industries. In 1688, a coffee house in London, owned by a man named Edward Lloyd, became a regular meeting spot for sailors, ship owners, and merchants who wanted to discuss and insure sea voyages. That coffee house eventually evolved into Lloyd's of London, which today remains one of the most important insurance markets on Earth. Stock trading in London also has roots in coffee houses, where merchants gathered to buy and sell shares long before formal stock exchanges existed. In a very real sense, modern global finance was brewed, quite literally, in a cup of coffee. But you'd think a drink capable of building empires of ideas and industry would be safe from controversy in Europe. It actually made things worse. Because as coffee's popularity exploded, it collided head-on with one of the oldest industries in Europe: beer and wine. Tavern owners watched their business disappear as people flocked to coffee houses instead. And in some places, coffee's rise triggered fierce backlash from people who depended on alcohol sales for their livelihood. In Prussia, King Frederick the Great became so alarmed by coffee's popularity that in 1777 he issued a formal complaint, worried that money was flowing out of his kingdom to pay for coffee imports instead of supporting local beer production, which he saw as a matter of national pride and economic stability. He went as far as trying to restrict coffee roasting to royally licensed roasters, employing so-called coffee sniffers whose job was to patrol the streets, sniffing the air for the illegal scent of home roasting. It's almost absurd to imagine today government agents wandering city streets, following the smell of coffee like bloodhounds, hunting down unlicensed roasters. But it shows just how seriously European rulers took this drink. Coffee wasn't just changing what people drank. It was changing economies, threatening old industries, and shifting where money and power flowed. And in France, coffee was about to do something even more explosive. By the 1700s, Paris had its own thriving coffeehouse culture, and one of them would become almost mythically important to world history. The Café de Procope, opened in Paris in 1686, became a gathering place for some of the most influential minds of the Enlightenment. Voltaire reportedly drank an extraordinary number of cups of coffee there each day. Some accounts claim as many as 40, mixed with chocolate. Diderot and other Enlightenment philosophers debated ideas within its walls, ideas about liberty, reason, and the rights of ordinary people against the power of kings. And a century later, in the years leading up to 1789, French coffeehouses became something even more dangerous to the monarchy than intellectual debate. They became meeting grounds for revolutionaries. Camille Desmoulins, one of the key figures who helped ignite the French Revolution, is said to have climbed onto a table outside the Café de Foix in Paris in July of 1789 and delivered a fiery speech calling citizens to arms. Just days later, the Bastille fell. Historians don't claim coffee caused the French Revolution. The causes were far larger: economic collapse, food shortages, enormous inequality, and decades of resentment against the monarchy. But coffeehouses provided something the revolution desperately needed: a physical space where ordinary citizens could gather, share information, debate grievances, and organize action, all while being kept awake and alert by the very drink in their cups. It's a strange thing to consider. The same drink that started as an energy source for Ethiopian warriors and a focus aid for Sufi mystics had, centuries later, become fuel for the collapse of one of the most powerful monarchies in the world. But while coffee was reshaping politics and ideas in Europe, an entirely different, much darker story was unfolding around how the coffee itself was being produced. For centuries, Yemen held something close to a global monopoly on coffee production. All coffee beans exported to the rest of the world passed through the port of Mocha, and Yemeni authorities guarded this monopoly fiercely. Coffee seeds were forbidden from leaving the country in a fertile, plantable state. Beans could only be exported after being roasted or boiled, specifically to prevent anyone from germinating new coffee plants elsewhere. For a while, this worked. Yemen controlled the world's coffee supply and controlled the enormous wealth that came with it. But monopolies built on secrecy rarely survive contact with human determination. Sometime around 1670, according to legend, a Sufi pilgrim named Baba Budan smuggled 7 raw, unroasted coffee beans out of Yemen by strapping them to his chest, and carried them back to India, where he planted them in the hills of Karnataka. It was a small act, 7 beans, but it cracked open a monopoly that had lasted for centuries. Around the same time, the Dutch, who had built one of the most powerful trading empires in the world, managed to obtain coffee plants and began cultivating them in their colonial territories, first in present-day Sri Lanka, and then far more successfully on the island of Java in modern-day Indonesia. This is where the word Java, as a slang term for coffee, actually comes from. The Dutch went on to gift a coffee plant to King Louis XIV of France in 1714. And this single plant, grown in the royal greenhouses of Paris, would go on to change the entire Western Hemisphere. In 1723, a French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu became obsessed with bringing coffee cultivation to French colonies in the Caribbean. According to the popular story, he managed to obtain a cutting from that very royal coffee plant and set sail for Martinique. The voyage nearly killed the plant, and possibly him. Legend claims that pirates attacked the ship, a storm nearly destroyed it, and fresh water grew so scarce that de Clieu shared his own limited drinking water ration with the fragile coffee seedling to keep it alive. You'd think that would be the end of a small, fragile plant's journey. It wasn't. The seedling survived the voyage and was successfully planted in Martinique. And from that single plant, historians estimate that the vast majority of coffee grown across Latin America and the Caribbean over the following centuries can trace its lineage. One plant, one obsessive naval officer, and an entire hemisphere's coffee industry. But this expansion of coffee cultivation across the Americas came at an enormous and horrifying human cost. As European colonial powers realized how profitable coffee could be, they established massive plantations across the Caribbean and Latin America, and these plantations were built and sustained through slavery. In Haiti, then the French colony of Saint-Domingue, coffee plantations exploded in number during the 1700s, and by the eve of the Haitian Revolution in 1791, the colony was producing more than half of the entire world's coffee supply. That production existed entirely because of the brutal enslavement of hundreds of thousands of African people, forced to work under horrific conditions on coffee and sugar plantations. The wealth extracted from their labor helped fund European economies, while the human beings who created that wealth were treated as property. In 1791, enslaved people in Saint-Domingue rose up in one of the largest and most successful slave revolts in history, eventually leading to Haiti's independence in 1804, and the complete collapse of its coffee industry in the chaos that followed. Coffee production shifted elsewhere, notably to Brazil, which by the 1800s and into the 1900s would become the largest coffee producer on Earth, a position it still holds today. But Brazil's early coffee industry was also built substantially on enslaved labor, with Brazil not abolishing slavery until 1888, one of the last countries in the Americas to do so. It's an uncomfortable truth that sits beneath the unpleasant ritual of a modern morning cup. The global spread of coffee, the very reason it became affordable and accessible to ordinary people around the world, was built in significant part on forced human labor and colonial exploitation. This history doesn't erase the cultural, intellectual, and economic significance coffee carried, but it's part of the story. An honest history requires sitting with both truths at once. By the 1800s, coffee had become deeply woven into daily life in Europe and the Americas. But it was still primarily consumed by those who could afford the time and money for coffeehouse culture. That was about to change, thanks less to romance and more to war. During the American Civil War in the 1860s, coffee became a crucial part of a soldier's daily rations, particularly in the Union Army. Soldiers were sometimes issued raw green coffee beans and expected to roast and grind them themselves over open fires between battles, a labor-intensive ritual that nonetheless became one of the few small comforts in an otherwise brutal experience. By World War I and especially World War II, coffee had become considered an essential wartime supply, so vital to military morale that it was rationed on the home front to ensure enough could be sent to soldiers overseas. Instant coffee, invented in various forms starting in the late 1800s, but perfected and mass-produced for the war effort, allowed soldiers to brew a cup in seconds, without fires, without grinding, without waiting. The war didn't just keep soldiers awake, it introduced millions of young men to coffee as a daily habit, one they carried home with them once the fighting ended, cementing coffee's place as a fixture of everyday civilian life across huge swaths of the world. And by the mid-1900s, coffee had transformed once again from a homemade ritual into a global commercial industry, with companies building entire empires around roasting, packaging, and distributing coffee to a public that increasingly expected it every single morning. But the story of coffee wasn't finished evolving. In the 1970s, a small coffee shop opened in Seattle, initially selling roasted coffee beans and equipment rather than brewed drinks. Its name was inspired by a character from the novel Moby Dick. That company was Starbucks, and though its early years were modest, it would go on, particularly after changes in direction during the 1980s and 90s, to fundamentally reshape how the entire world thinks about coffee. Coffee stopped being simply a drink you made at home or grabbed quickly at a diner counter. It became an experience, a daily ritual, a third place between home and work, complete with its own vocabulary of lattes, macchiatos, and cold brews that would have been utterly unrecognizable to a Sufi monk sipping kahwa in 15th century Yemen. Today, coffee is one of the most traded commodities on Earth, historically ranked among the most valuable legally traded commodities in global markets, behind only things like crude oil in terms of total trade value in various periods. Tens of millions of people worldwide depend on coffee farming for their livelihoods, most of them smallholder farmers working small plots of land across regions like Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. And yet a significant portion of the wealth generated by coffee still doesn't reach the farmers who grow it, a modern echo of the deep inequalities that have shadowed coffee's global story since its earliest days of colonial expansion. Climate change now threatens the very existence of coffee as we know it. Scientists studying wild coffee species, including the original Arabica plants,